Okay, hello. My name is Maya Rocky Moore Cummings, and I am President and CEO of Global Policy Solutions, and I'm also pleased to be your host for today's webinar, sponsored by the Collaborative for Racial Equity Working Group, also known as CREW. The title of today's session is The Urgency of Now, Promoting Equity in Recovery and Infrastructure. As you all know, COVID-19 has devastated the nation. It has had a particularly pernicious effect on communities most harmed by the health and economic impacts of COVID-19. Unfortunately, many of these communities are the same people in the same places who were disproportionately burdened by low income, low wealth, poor health, and lower educational attainment even before the pandemic started. So we are grateful that the Biden administration was able to work with a bipartisan Congress. Now, you know how hard it is to get bipartisanship nowadays, but the Biden administration was able to work with a bipartisan Congress to pass and sign the American Rescue Plan in March of 2021, with calls for equity in the distribution of resources. Now, our task today is to discuss how the rollout of these funds are going, and most importantly, whether the communities that have been hardest hit, particularly low-income communities of color, are receiving their equitable share of the resources. Now, you will note that I did not say fair share, because equity requires a higher standard of operation, one that takes account of the long-term effects of discrimination and resource deprivation. This is an urgent matter, not just because the communities desperately need the investments, but because the American Rescue Plan is designed to sunset, with communities required to obligate their funds by December 31st, 2024, with the possibility of having those funds returned to the federal treasury by December of 2026 if they are not expended. So with that, I want to welcome my distinguished panel of expert guests who I'm going to ask to introduce themselves by sharing their name, title, organization, and a brief explanation of why their organization is so concerned about this matter. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Diallo Brooks. Take yourself off of mute.
Thank you, Maya, and thank you for all the participants that have joined us today for this very, very important conversation. My name is Diallo Brooks. I am the Senior Vice President of Programs and Advocacy at the Schott Foundation, and I'm based in Washington, D.C. The reason why we are here and why Schott is a part of this conversation is that we understand that these inequities that we are seeing go beyond just what's happening in the classroom and what's happening with schools. We know that there's an intersectionality with a variety of factors that are happening within communities. And we want to make sure that communities have the tools necessary to make sure that all of this unprecedented amount of federal resources that are pouring into states and then into cities is actually used to create equity, used to really rethink the way we do budgeting on the ground in communities around the country to make sure that the communities that we care about the most, the ones that are impacted the most, actually get their fair share of resources. So that's why we're here. We're part of this CREW table. We're excited to be in partnership with all of the other organizations here, and we'll dig deeper more later.
Thanks, Diallo. Sarah Truhaft, can you please share your name?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm Sarah Truhaft, Vice President of Research at PolicyLink. And, PolicyLink is a national nonprofit research and action institute. Our mission is advancing racial and economic equity. So with this administration's unprecedented commitment to racial equity, right? Like there was a day one executive order on advancing racial equity. We've never had that as a governing principle. That's so critical. And then we have these unprecedented resources, but the administration is not going to do it alone, right? We need to hold the administration accountable to delivering on that commitment, which means advocating, which means tracking, following the money. Is it really being manifested? So that's why we're in this and tracking ARPA and the infrastructure dollars.
Policy Link had a little bit something to do with that administration equity mandate, right?
Hopefully. I mean, we've been advocating for equity way before it was popular, when everyone was saying, don't say equity. So, you know.
So was I. Okay. Karthik.
Thank you for having us here. So I'm Karthik Ramakrishnan. I'm a professor of public policy and the founder and director of the Center for Social Innovation at UC Riverside. We are interested in this, like many of you, because we see the potential and the opportunity. This is a once in a generation opportunity that we have. And we are concerned that we are squandering the opportunity, that in the call for speed, that we are leaving communities behind and potentially unintentionally, or in some cases intentionally, depending on the jurisdiction, creating new legacies of disadvantage that'll be really hard to dig out of for the coming generations. So we think that we love the title of this webinar. It is urgent. We need to do it now. And we hope, especially that private philanthropy can come in a strategic, targeted, and timely way to make a big difference for this once in a generation investment.
You know, thanks for mentioning that, Karthik. I'm going to loop back around to that in a few minutes. I think it's an important point to make. Sarah Beth Gale, introduce yourself.
Thanks so much, Maya. Sarah Beth Gale, Executive Director of the Southern Economic Advancement Project, or SEAP. We focus on 12 southeastern states in the areas of economic security, climate, and health. And we do some policy research, but really try to act as a network builder and bridge builder across the South, to spread good ideas and also to bring the Southern context to national conversations, to make sure that communities in the South are not getting left behind. So we're really excited about this opportunity, particularly building resources for community partners to make sure that all voices are at the table when these decisions are being made at the local level.
Fantastic. And then last but not least, Sylvia, can you share who you are, what you do, why you're concerned?
Thank you. My name is Sylvia Fabella. I'm the program director at Local Progress, which is both a movement and organization of local elected officials from across the country who are advancing a racial and economic justice agenda through all levels of local government. And I would say that the local elected officials in our network are fighting to reshape what is possible in localities across the country. And as an organization, we work with and educate people on how to govern from a place of values. And we believe that cities, counties, and school boards, they're all the epicenter of progressive advancement, particularly in the absence of a proactive and/or functional federal government, regardless of whether that's a lackluster administration or a hostile one. And so at Local Progress, we share a vision with members that is really rooted both in race equity and centers the importance of collaborative governance, where we're bringing in people who've historically been excluded from policymaking, and that we can build power together by acting collectively across jurisdictions and across states to build power at the state and national level. And so for us, similar to what everyone else has said, these are historic levels of funding, and that is at the core of how we make progress in the ways that we want to change our communities.
Those who have been historically left out. I think that is a common theme that we're hearing here, and we're going to dig into why that's the case. You know, Sarah Truhaft, I definitely want us to give your perspective on why, in principle, should ARP funds, what should they be used for? And what are the success factors to know that they're being used in a good way?
Yeah, thank you. So I'll pull up a slide in a moment, but right when the American Rescue Plan was passed, we recognized the need for a framework and approach to ensure that equity, which, as you mentioned, Maya, was embedded in the legislation itself, and communities are supposed to direct these resources to those that have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and by structural inequities preceding the pandemic, right? But equity is not business as usual in cities and counties and states. They are building up their infrastructure for equity, which I know we'll touch upon, but for most cities, it's not like how they operate. So what we did was, and I'll share my screen here, we put out a report in May of last year, highlighting 10 priorities for the use of these resources. And I'm not going to go through each one of these, but it goes from the process by which the decisions are made and who's engaged in the process and what are the criteria for allocating the resources, right, to what sort of investments. But I think to summarize what we would think of as good investments, we want the investments to be targeted to those communities. We want communities to have analyzed who's been hardest hit by the pandemic, where do inequities lie, how do we get resources to those communities. And then we want to see longer term investments in the structural inequities, housing, economic opportunity, digital inclusion, public health, right? We want to see investments going to those inequities that are perpetuating racial inequity in our communities. So that's sort of what we would say for the principles. And then with respect to what we're seeing in terms of success factors. So we have a research project right now with the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy. It's at the New School, and it's an institute led by Dr. Derek Hamilton, who's an economist focusing on the racial wealth gap. And we've been reviewing what cities in particular have been doing. And what we've seen, and this is sort of preliminary, we're going to be putting out reports in the next couple of months, but the factors that have influenced whether cities operationalize this are really three. One being advocacy. Our communities advocating and engaging in the ARPA process on their own behalf to say, we need to direct the funds to these uses. The second one is really equity leadership from the top. No surprise, but in a city, if you have a mayor who campaigned on an equity agenda and is coming in with a set of priorities, those cities tended to do better in terms of allocating these resources in alignment with those priorities. So Boston is a great example of this with Mayor Wu. St. Louis is another example, right, where you had an equity mayor coming in and doing everything she can to direct these resources equitably. And then the third factor is really the institutional infrastructure in cities for equity. So the Government Alliance for Racial Equity kind of exemplifies this movement across the country in local governments, advancing equity, adopting equity principles, equity budgeting tools, having chief equity officers. So we see that the cities that had some of those institutional elements and understanding of how to invest these resources equitably, tended to do better.
So actually, Sarah, do you mind if me add, so was there any equity teeth in the actual ARPA bill? I mean, were there any requirements for state and localities to actually abide by the principles of equity within the legislation itself?
So the rules, there was an interim rule that cities followed for a long time, and then the final rule was just published in terms of how you can spend these resources. And investing in disadvantaged communities is a key part of investing in the communities hardest hit, really is a key part of the legislation. I think the issue that comes up, and I think that the other Sarah will be able to speak to this more intimately, is that for smaller cities, there's just this difference in the extent of reporting on equity in the ARPA investments for the larger cities above populations above 250,000 and smaller cities. So the larger cities, had to submit these performance reports, and there was a template asking them, how did equity guide your decision making? And so cities, not all of the large cities answered that question deeply. Some did, some did not, some didn't even submit the reports, but but there was this reporting requirement for the larger cities, but that requirement did not extend to the smaller cities. And then there is a sort of a way out for smaller cities to just allocate the resources to general government. And that becomes much less accountable to the sort of equity goals and reporting guidelines from the federal government.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. Karthik, you mind if I turn to you? I know that you're excellent at creating frameworks that matter, to get people to think about how to actually do this and do it well. So if you could share what your your keys to successful equitable decision-making around ARPA is and what framework we should be using it'd be greatly appreciated.
Great, thank you, Maya. So at CSI, what we tend to focus on frameworks that can improve investments, policies, practices. We have a bias towards action. So whatever frameworks we come up with, they borrow from various academic and other practitioner frameworks and try to solve a particular matter at hand. So when we got wind of the infrastructure bill and the American Rescue Plan, being likely, we got to work in terms of coming up with a proposal that got us beyond the standard focus on shovel readiness, right? Often when it comes to infrastructure spending, either when we're talking about the infrastructure bill or other types of capital investments that are coming through the American Rescue Plan, there is a bias towards shovel readiness. Whatever is ready to go, we got to get money out the door. We got to literally have shovels in the ground so people have their photo opportunities to then declare it a success. Now, we don't want to reject that notion because readiness is important. It makes a difference if a particular area has the infrastructure readiness to move quickly or not. But we believe that other values are also important, often talked about in the buildup to legislation and certainly in implementation as well. So we came up with a framework that we call the Ready to Rise framework, which has infrastructure readiness, but adds other important elements like resilience, like inclusion, like sustainability and equity. We believe that this is a framework that'll be helpful outside of the American Rescue Plan context and can serve as a set of best practices and also aspirational indicators that people can use to measure progress, either in terms of performance, if you're talking about internally, or accountability when it comes to community. One important piece of that is inclusion. Now, people might ask, what does inclusion have to do with equity? There are reams of studies which show that it's very difficult to get to equity in terms of outcomes if you do not have community inclusion as an important part of it. The International Association for Public Participation has come up with a very practical, pragmatic framework in terms of setting the expectations right in terms of government agencies, in terms of what kind of inclusion they're talking about. And you can find this in our report, and I'll put this in the chat in a little bit, in terms of report that we did in the Salton Sea region, in terms of thinking about ways that jurisdictions can do better when it comes to inclusion, and importantly, come up with measures and indicators for inclusion. Here's an overview of some key indicators that we have and conceptual definitions of what do we mean by readiness? What do we mean by resiliency? I mean, especially for the American Rescue Plan, if we're talking about a post-COVID context in terms of health impacts as well as economic impacts of the pandemic, it's important to be systematic about what we mean in terms of building more resilient communities. Inclusion, what do we mean by that? Sustainability, and then finally equity, right? Where it's both in terms of the intentional focus as well as outcomes and whether they actually improve. This is something that we're hoping at the state level, and we'll talk about that later on in the program in terms of places that are doing some of this well, or at least are moving in a hopeful direction. So we're hopeful that agencies in California will find frameworks like these helpful. Importantly, we are hoping that jurisdictions, including cities and counties, will see this as a kind of indicators that ultimately could be seen as similar to, say, LEED certification. What does it mean for a jurisdiction or a project to be able to grade themselves and ultimately be judged on how well they are doing when it comes to inclusion, sustainability, and equity.
Grade themselves, or have the public actually hold them accountable? I don't know. Where are we there?
I think it's a both and, right? I mean, I think that we generally try to have asset-based narratives and aspirational, but I think it's the kind of thing in which, it's either, are we going to look at this as a report card where you grade people A, B, C, D, E, and F, or are we thinking about it in terms of LEED, in terms of, silver, gold, and platinum certification? I think there's room for both types of strategies. And what we're hoping to do is to build the indicators that can enable that kind of measurement.
So thank you for that. I'd like to both turn to Sylvia and Diallo right now, because, I'm just curious, what are some of the obstacles to the fair and equitable distribution of these funds? Why aren't we seeing enough community engagement, or are we?
Diallo, do you want me to?
Yeah, go ahead and start, Sylvia.
First Sylvia, and then we'll go to Diallo.
All right, let me share my screen. So I would say to this that there are lots of obstacles, but primarily I want to begin with a critically important one around state interference. Last year, Texas enacted HB 1925, which effectively criminalizes camping in public spaces unless those places have been designated and approved for camping. And the statute itself disproportionately impacts people experiencing homelessness by exposing them to citation, fines, and further displacement simply because they do not have shelter. We've seen that now replicated in several other places, but most recently in Arizona. And so in Arizona, they're doing something very similar, but they've now pegged that to the $30 million $50 million that are coming from ARP funding, despite the fact that Treasury guidance actually stipulates that states are not allowed to add additional stipulations to the funds. So this is a pattern that we're seeing. And in terms of actually, I'll take a step back and say that we also saw that in the CARES Act as well, where states were holding the money, not pushing it out, giving smaller localities a really hard time accessing it and creating barriers and essentially letting the money sit in funds without being distributed. So I think that there is an element of preemption that is happening there. Yeah, maybe I'll take a pause there and kick it over to you, Diallo. But I think that that's a key component. Or actually, let me switch slides and share a couple of more things outside of state interference. But I would say that for us, we've also noticed that there are a couple of key lessons in terms of how much mayors matter. Much of the decision-making power for the use of ARP funds rests with executives. So mayors are often making plans without consulting councils as much as they should. And so many times we're hearing from local progress members, all of whom are elected at the city, county, or school board level, that they find out about how funds are being dedicated through press releases, because those processes are sometimes being driven by city managers, directors of finance, and mayors who have an orientation towards a small c conservatism around how to hold that money so that they don't face clapback from the feds at a later point if they don't feel like they're meeting the broad strokes direction from the Treasury rule. And so it's pretty difficult to navigate that. I can share more later about what happens when you have really good mayors in place. So I'll hold that and maybe just say a little bit around the equity in our perspective. No, you know what, Diallo, I'm going to pause and let you have a moment here.
No, I appreciate that. And I think one of the things to your question, Maya, around some of the obstacles is also some of the transparency that we're not seeing coming out of the states. I think it was mentioned before that as money hits the states, how states are allocating those resources to those cities across the country is a huge obstacle, and why folks are having problems on the ground really driving toward equity, because they don't even understand or have great systems in place to actually capture how some of that funding is coming down. The other piece that I think is really critically important is that we need to have some infrastructure on the ground that's actually really paying attention not just to equity more broadly, but looking at all of the different funding streams of everything from how the city is making funding decisions, how philanthropy may be funding or supporting funding, and also how the federal funds are moving in, and really creating dashboards that really have some indicators that are able to really look at where dollars are going, and having this kind of cross-departmental conversations on the ground in communities, and also having communities be able to actually see how those dollars are flowing. So there's a need for some stronger infrastructure on the ground, both kind of a civic infrastructure that has folks from the government, but also have folks from community organizations as well that are participating in actually tracking the dollars, because there's a lot of language around equity that we see exists, but sometimes that language doesn't really translate into the dollars actually hitting the communities that need it the most. One of the things that we've done at the Schaff Foundation early on in 2018 was do our Loving Cities Index, because we basically felt that there need to be a building of a loving system in order for cities and states to really move toward equity and justice on the ground. And so what we did is we created indicators that really looked at cities and measured cities and where they are and actually moving toward equity across different issue areas. So everything from health to transportation to housing to education. We're education focused foundation, but we know that we can't achieve what we want to achieve in education without all of these other factors being integrated. And so we're really looking at how we integrate the conversation around driving resources toward equity in ways that these different parts of the system are actually communicating and working in tandem to actually make sure that the communities that are most impacted have the resources they need to be successful and be actually loving environments and loving communities.
The fact that, I mean, we often heard a statistic about teachers being the most important in-school factor for a student's success. But then when you look at the whole picture, I've seen a statistic, something like 80% of a child's educational success is dependent upon out-of-school factors.
Correct.
So that means that, you know, you've got to be concerned about the social determinants of education in order to make sure that students are getting what they need to be successful.
Exactly.
So, Sarah Beth Gale, I heard dashboards, and when I hear dashboards, I think of deep. I think that you need to tell us exactly what you've been building across the South in terms of dashboards, but you also need to share what are the special considerations and barriers that Southern US states are actually facing?
So at the beginning of COVID, governors across the US were coming out with kind of statements of value saying, here's how we're going to respond in an equitable manner to COVID-19. But you did not see that in the South. There were not governors standing up widespread saying this. And so we had a lot of the advocates and nonprofit partners that we work with come to us and say, there's a vacuum here and the nonprofit community needs to fill that in the South because public officials are not doing it. And so we formed a coalition called South Strong to really look at a value statement regionally of what an equitable recovery would look like and what a post-pandemic South could look like. And to do policy development and network building and capacity building. And so when the American Rescue Plan funds came, this was really the opportunity for us to say the dollars are here. Now, these ideas and these visions for the South that we've been having, now's the time to move forward and implement them. And one of the things indicator-wise that we've been doing is a project called Pandemic to Prosperity South. And if I can share my screen real quick. Let's see. So looking at, with some of our partners, looking at just key indicators across the South compared to the nation. And, you know, we know there's historic inequities in the South, but looking at some of the compounding issues that are happening here. So 2 out of 3 Southerners have experienced a climate disaster during COVID. And if you look at Louisiana, you know, there it's every single parish has experienced multiple disasters. We're less vaccinated in the South. Our public systems are weaker. So things like emergency rental assistance has gone out a lot slower than in other places. We have news deserts and lack of broadband. So just information sharing and communication about these issues is weaker here. And so what we've been building is toolkits, both for local government officials, but also community advocates, to really step up equity and engagement in American Rescue Plan funds. A lot of the toolkit you could use anywhere in the nation. You could really apply it to any local government. But what we have done is really intentionally focused on the South in terms of outreach. And so reaching out to local government officials, reaching out to NAACPs, civic organizations, United Ways, to really make sure that everyone's aware of this opportunity, to make sure everyone is aware of what's happening in other places so we can spread good ideas about really what these funds can accomplish, and to really build confidence that you can use these funds in really bold and flexible ways to meet the needs of community in an equitable way. So I'm happy to share more about the toolkit later, or can launch into it now, whatever you want, Maya.
Well, actually, I'd like for you to actually address the question that I asked Sylvia and Diallo. Have you seen some unfair practices happening in the South in terms of localities accessing these funds or being held to a different standard? I know that I've been particularly watching, actually, the Schott Foundation has been watching, Mississippi and what's happening with their water and sewer project, and how the state's actually been holding the city, I think, to a different standard than every other locality in the state with regards to the distribution of funds. Have you seen anything else?
Yeah, I think that, there's some cities, one thing that we always say is there's a lot of cities that haven't made decisions. And so there's still an opportunity for people to be engaged and to really have that community voice and community input. But there were a number of cities in the South that when they received the funds, they made the plan and really did not engage the community at all. So one of the things that we've been tracking are for those cities in the South that have some spending plan, can we identify any kind of equity statement or equity practice? And can we identify any really kind of meaningful engagement with the community? And unfortunately, we've been doing 120 cities. We found 34 of those 120 where we could really identify an equity practice in their ARP decision-making, and 36 of the 120 that had any kind of community engagement. And so there's a real gap, a real lack of equity and engagement. And so this, again, is an area where people really need to be pushing hard, because I think unless advocates come and demand that, there's a lot of communities, a lot of governments in the South that are just not going to engage in equity and engagement.
So, at this point, I'm just going to pause and I'm going to ask the assembled audience to, put questions in the Q&A. We will be getting to a Q&A, but I do also want to point out that in the chat, we've got two very important notes related to what Sarah just said. Kia Burt from Hope Policy Institute said, we serve the Deep South, and Sarah is spot on. CARES Act reimbursement models in Alabama, for example, made it difficult for Black Belt counties to access critical funds to survive the COVID impact. And then someone named Glennie Pooh said, I think that there is an underestimation of the resistance to transparency and application of these ARP CARES Act funds in the South, especially with small towns. There's also concern about organizations like UW really reaching all segments. We need help and accountability. That's coming from someone in the South. So, with that, I'd actually like to ask everyone a rapid fire question. And this is just a yes or no question. Based on the evidence that you've seen thus far, you're all out there paying attention to what's happening on the ground, you're reading reports, you're putting together dashboards, et cetera. How are low-income communities of color faring? Are they receiving their equitable share of ARP monies? And I'll start with Sylvia, and then we'll go around.
On paper, in some ways, yes. In practice, mixed bag.
Okay, Sarah Beth.
I would say no. I think right now we're seeing an overwhelming amount go to revenue replacement. And when it becomes kind of a a black hole of it's just going to be general funds, then it's extremely hard to say that it's being equitably spent.
Karthik.
It's, we still are grappling with limited data, but it seems like it's highly dependent on geography. We've been talking about states, but even within states like California, wide variation by counties, with those county supervisors playing a critical role.
Wow. Sarah Truhaft.
Yeah, I agree with Sylvia that it's a mixed bag. It really depends on the place, with like high inequities in the South and smaller cities. I think that's like the largest area for concern, but even in the largest cities, it really depends.
So Diallo, Sarah Beth Gale said no, straight up no. Sylvia and Sarah voted for mixed bag. And then so did Karthik. Karthik voted for mixed bag. Can you give your impression, but also share the stakes that if we end up with this money not going to the communities that need it most, what is at stake? And I also invite others who want to talk to actually jump in. Diallo.
So to answer your question, I would say no, from a mixed bag to no, that it's not happening in the way it needs to happen. And the reason I say no is because unless we see the practice of budgeting actually fundamentally change because of this influx of money that's coming in, we will just see stuff revert back to the way it was. This is the opportunity to create real change in the way we budget. We make budgeting decisions on the ground. And I just don't feel like most jurisdictions, from what I've seen, have made that pivot. I think it's kind of like this emergency mindset. We will drive toward equity for now in the places that are actually trying to do that. But I think in most places, we're still behind the 8 ball as far as changing the culture of budgeting in their decision-making toward equity, and equity centered in that. And what was the second part of your question?
Karthik, I was like, you're going to jump.
Okay.
What's at stake?
I was going to say, I am closer to a no than a mixed bag, right? I mean, I think the places where it is working well are so few. And it's really, I wouldn't want the audience to think like, oh, mixed bag, it's like a 50, at least for me, from what I see, it's the success stories are actually quite rare.
I agree, same. I think that the thing I want to guard against is like thinking that it's all a closed process, because there are still, like, if you look at the tracker Sarah Beth showed, right, there's still a lot of money on the table. A lot of it has been allocated, but these are decisions that are happening now. So there are still many fights to be had to steer those resources in an equitable direction.
All right. So go ahead, Sarah Beth.
I've converted everyone to no, but I will say that, I echo all of this, that there are good examples, and they're in surprising places. It can be a small rural town that's made phenomenal progress, and it looks like they're going to change things. So there are those bright spots. And I think part of the work of all of us on this call is holding up those bright spots, and really showing again and again that it can happen every place, and that that these are places that we care about, and we need to keep working towards them.
Sylvia?
So I do want to double down a little bit on the bright spots. That's actually as a forever optimist.
The bright spots.
There are absolutely places like St. Louis, where half of the ARP funds, because Mayor Tashara Jones, who is a longtime local progress member and is a treasurer, holds equity at the heart and core of how she wants to govern. As a really good example, she spent 50% of the ARP funds strictly on equity-based projects, and they have a range. And I'll share my screen in a second. But then there's another place like St. Paul, Minnesota, where Mayor Melvin Carter, yes, he only was able to get 80 people to engage in the ARP process, but they had more than 1,000 community members engage in a conversation about redefining public safety there. And that was reflected in the ARP spending, where you start to see then, $40 million sent to neighborhood safety, non-policing public safety programs, $40 million into housing, $40 million into youth programs and job and career readiness program, where when we're thinking about what does community safety mean, it doesn't mean just policing, and it's a fundamental pedal shift in how those ARP funds are used. So maybe I'm really leaning on those very specifics, but largely, it's just, everyone is right. On paper, in practice, not so much.
So it sounds like we're already getting into best practices and we haven't talked about accountability. So I think that what I thought I saw Diallo's hand. Diallo, did you want to end up with what's at stake?
Yeah, just one other thing that what's at stake too. I think there's an opportunity here. And so part of the leaning into no is not that there aren't these bright examples. We want to lift up those bright examples. But if we don't fundamentally change the way we do business with this amount of money that's coming in, it's going to be very hard to do it in the future. So the urgency of now is here, right? We also need our philanthropic partners also to lean into this moment as well. Philanthropy can't change what's happening on the ground, but they can influence the direction of that change and really invest in the structures that are needed on the ground to help make sure that cities are moving toward equity with this type of funding and have a longer term plan to get us toward equity in the budgeting process, in driving resources to the communities that need them the most.
So there's two Sarahs, Sarah Beth and Sarah Truhaft. I'd like for you to actually share how city and states are actually being held accountable. What are the tracking tools and mechanisms that your organizations and or the localities themselves using to track how the monies are being spent? Start with Sarah Beth and then we'll go to Sarah Truhaft.
Great, I'm going to share my screen again. So like I mentioned, we've been building this toolkit both for activists and for local governments, and there's a lot in it. But two of the big things in there, we do a community needs survey. We've piloted across 3 states in the South, and we've been doing it with Propel, a tech company. Their app providers is for food insecure households. And so it's really reaching a marginalized population that is not often included in budget conversations in local communities. And so we've been running it to ask these questions are, what are your main challenges? How would you prioritize these federal recovery funds in your community? And spoiler alert, it's housing and utilities across the board, no matter how you cut it. But really stepping in and saying, if communities aren't asking you, then we'll ask you and we'll publicize the results. And one of the questions we ask is, has anyone reached out to you in your community about these? And 90% say no, no one has ever talked to me about these funds. So again, we see that gap of engagement. So we'll continue to run this survey and hopefully expand it to other states in the coming months. And the other is our local funds tracker. So we've been tracking funds, like I said, over 120 cities. We're adding more cities in about 2 weeks, which is exciting. And we look at a couple of things. One is whether there's equity and engagement that we can identify. One is whether how much of their pot has been decided on to really show advocates, yes, there's still time to give voice in this. And then we categorize the funds. Is it going to housing support, small business support, public health, community violence interventions, water sewer, revenue replacement? So that communities can compare what their decisions are compared to other ones in their states or other states in general, and really see, who and what they're prioritizing in their ARP. So happy to share more on that afterwards, but it's at theseep.org, and I'll also put the link in there. But I think that the two big takeaways are there is still time in a lot of communities. There's still a lot of dollars on the table to move those dollars around. And there is still time to really push on equity and engagement and hold up those bright spots of where we can emulate.
Sarah Truhaft.
Yeah, so I don't have a slide, but because our research project is, we have preliminary results, so expect something to come out soon. But this is a research project with the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy at the New School. And what we did was a few things. We did a content analysis of the reports that cities submitted to the Treasury and asked a series of about 20 questions relating to equitable spending, and so, for example, like a preview of what we found, 63 of 89 could even be analyzed, right? Even had enough data to analyze. And of the 63, 57 of them showed some race consciousness. Diallo, this goes to your point, right? Like equity in name, right? So that's a pretty high share, right? But then when we looked at, for example, how many of the cities used equity tools to determine how to use the funding, it's just 37 of the 63, right? So we're collecting that data and going to be reporting on that data. And of course, kind of this is where my mixed bag comment comes from, right? Because these are the largest cities, the cities that are most likely to have advocacy and equity infrastructure. So we just know it's a lot less in other places. But we're also doing case studies in partnership with Sarah and Southern Economic Advancement Project. We've done case studies, for example, of St. Louis, which Sylvia was talking about, and Boston and Los Angeles and Savannah, describing how they did apply an equity lens to decision-making and have some equity investments. And then we've been collecting the set of equity investments. So, expect that to come out soon.
So everybody wants to talk about best practices. Let's talk about best practices. What are the examples of the leading cities or towns out there who are doing it well? We've heard about St. Louis. Are there others that you want to uplift? And I want to tell you that Ramon Perez wants to understand, are there any best practices on equitable budgeting? What are the examples that are out there that focus on equitable budgeting? You want to start, Sarah, and then we'll just do a round robin?
Yeah, I have one slide here. I have a slide. I don't know why it's okay there. Wait, hold on a second. Sorry, I'm trying to find. There it is. Okay, so Los Angeles. I love this example because it's an equity example, and you can compare, for example, so this is Los Angeles County. Los Angeles City, I think, allocated more than half of their funding to police. This is from investigative journalism report in The Guardian by Sam Levin. But Los Angeles County, a coalition formed around equitable implementation of ARPA, led by Advancement Project California, which is an incredibly data savvy organization. They were worried that the supervisors in the county would allocate the resources evenly across the districts, right? And they have a COVID risk index, COVID risk and recovery index that showed, need is concentrated in some areas. So they used that index to say, hey, we need to allocate the funding aligned with need. And the supervisors have a whole set of an ordinance. They have an equity dashboard. I'll put the URL in the chat, but they adopted equity principles based on this advocacy, a funding formula based on the index of need, public accountability and transparency in terms of the dashboard, and this really common sense but innovative policy around communities that are most impacted, but not necessarily geographically concentrated, right? Which I think is really important because, not everybody is in a concentrated poverty situation, but might live in the suburbs. So, as you see here, the results, like 75% of it is going to neighborhoods hardest hit by the pandemic in this county. So this is a shining star example because of the advocacy that was there.
Very good. Karthik.
In terms of best practices, as well as, room to grow. So, people have been talking about, smaller cities. I'll give from the example in California. So Los Angeles is Los Angeles County. I'll talk about counties because, in states like California, yes, cities have sizable budgets, but counties have very large budgets, and especially potentially that could be used for things like public safety, health, and more generally on land use regulation. They play huge roles. Los Angeles County is a bright example of county supervisors working with Advancement Project California and a whole bunch of other community partners to bake in equity indicators in terms of monitoring progress and the plans for implementation. But for counties like LA, you have counties further east where we are in Riverside County and San Bernardino County, where there isn't that transparency, there isn't that strong prior commitment that these are the principles we're going to follow, And these are the methodologies that we're going to use to do it. And these are not small counties, by the way. So Riverside and San Bernardino County, the Inland Empire of Southern California, it's as large as South Carolina in terms of population and geography. You have many counties in inland California and in the San Joaquin Valley that are similarly situated, in which you have, suburban to rural, Black and brown populations that are not being served and being paid attention to the way you have it in cities like Los Angeles or cities like Oakland or Alameda County. So that's, we have to be very attentive to that in terms of this county level variation. Finally, I'll say in the state of California, initially the Community Economic Resilience Fund was under the American Rescue Plan. Since then, the state has decided to put it under the general fund because for various reasons, including having more time, but also being able to prioritize the climate goals of the state that weren't necessarily an important part of the federal guidance. And so that's something that jurisdictions may want to think about, is if they want to add even additional aspirational goals beyond what is envisioned in the American Rescue Plan, to think about ways of using general fund money to do that, to raise the standards over and above what is envisioned by Treasury.
So I just want to put in a plug for LA County. I actually got a personal tour of their dashboard from the chief of staff to the county supervisor, and also with the chief research officer for the county. And they did an amazing job in pulling together their dashboard, so much so that they can actually show how they're spending their dollars down to the census tract. And so, I put in the chat the link to their dashboard. They've used GIS, geographical information systems, to actually be able to map, to visually show you how the money is being spent, in addition to having a very sophisticated dashboard with very sophisticated indicators that were modeled and they were tested. I'm talking about sophistication to the highest degree that I've seen. So with that, I'm going to go over to Sarah Beth Gale. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in and right on what you're saying, Maya, of, SEEP kind of sees itself as gathering the smaller towns examples. And so we're pulling together right now, what are those dashboards that smaller towns are putting together that we can hold up? Either ones that are done by vendors, but also if you have a tiny IT department, what can we really reasonably expect? So hopefully in the next month or so, we'll start putting out some of those examples for smaller towns to look towards. We're excited that New Orleans has just last week or week before last passed an ordinance. Their city council really pushed by advocates to pass this ordinance saying, we're going to have a dashboard tracking these indicators, and we're going to have regular reports from the CAO giving us information about ARP. So we're also excited about that kind of policy push of an ordinance saying we will hold ourselves accountable in this way. Two other things I would put on there. Somebody asked about, is Arkansas going to be in your tracker? We're hoping to expand, but I'm not quite sure if we'll get Arkansas anytime soon, but we're happy to talk to you about how we do our methodology. We've talked to folks in California and Minnesota, if other states themselves want to replicate it. And then I would hold up the city of Denver, their performance plan on their equity outreach and engagement efforts was really outstanding. So if folks want to look at a plan, I would really hold up the city of Denver. And then my last, I'll put a link in the chat, but we often lift up the city of Austin for just equity and budgeting in general. So outside of the ARP process, they have a really interesting equity committee structure where they have radically changed their budgeting practices, and it really has changed their budget outcomes as well. So I'll throw a link to a report we did on them in the chat too.
I may say, yes, I would like to replicate it here in Arkansas. All right, Diallo, and then Sylvia, and then we're gonna just transition to institutionalization. Keep your questions coming. We're actually gonna go to 2:15 Eastern time, which means that we've got exactly like 17 minutes left. But I encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A. Diallo, and then Sylvia. You're on mute, Diallo.
Sorry about that. I don't have any additional cities to lift up or places to lift up. I will just say this. I mean, part of the creation of Crew, this table, is that there's so much expertise that exists out there, and we really want to make sure that all of the information that folks have been sharing on this presentation, cities and states are able to access that in a place. They have a go-to place to be able to connect to that, because we feel like there's a lot of folks that are building some great examples, building some great tools that folks can use. And being a part of this partnership really helps us to make sure we provide some technical support to folks on the ground that are looking to try to do this work the right way. Because I think there is some want in places around the country to actually do the right thing on the ground. It's just sometimes that they don't have access to all of the information that they need in order to make that happen.
Right. We've got a question from Sindel Revaluri, and I know that I've butchered your name and I apologize. I apologize. Is there a tension between equitable budgeting and participatory budgeting if the representation of voices also differs? For example, in their efforts to engage, they found a much different response rate across race and class lines. So Sylvia, I'm going to come to you. If you want to answer that, you can, but I want you to lift up other best practices that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to start with the latter. I would say that I think we've all touched on this a little bit, but there are larger aspirational goals. And I think that we're all in agreement that people shouldn't be spending ARP funds just on this particular moment, but they're investing in their long-term vision, long-term goals, strategic goals for their cities. And that this is set forth through with community engagement, and again, not just a one-time influx of cash to fix or replace budget loss. And so to that end, what we have been advocating for within the Local Progress Network, and we built a leadership body of elected officials that really helped to design this. And I'll drop the link in the chat, but this idea that this is the moment to reimagine everything, fully resourced public institutions and systems that contribute to people's ability to thrive and operate with transparency and accountability and with equity. And so I'm going to drop that in the chat, but I think it's really useful because what we did was try to call together some really exciting and innovative examples of how certain places have tacked on or have created programs that are really exciting. And just to give you an example of what one of those is, that is a long-term goal that was deeply connected to ARP funding, was in Boston. They got rid of the tipped minimum wage. In order for people to access ARP funds for restaurants, they pegged it to phasing out the tipped minimum wage and increasing it up to, I think, 21 or 26, about $21 by 2026. There's a case study in here, I'm blanking on the number, but that's one way to really couple the current moment with long-term vision and long-term goals, which is really exciting. So folks should feel free to peruse that, but it offers a framework around how people should be thinking about budgets and community safety and development, et cetera.
Did you want to speak to the difference between equitable budgeting and participatory budgeting?
I mean, I feel like my thought on that is that it is it will turn out different folks. Participatory budgeting, I think, has been going on for quite a while, and it tends to pull up wealthier and whiter folks because they have more time and availability to be able to participate in those processes. But by way of coming back to the example of St. Paul, where people really showed up to talk about community safety and redefining policing, it pulled in a different group of people who are really willing and able to think creatively about that process. So I don't know that I have a suggested thought and would welcome other panelists to weigh in, but I definitely absolutely agree that it pulls in a different audience depending, just in general.
Karthik, going to you.
Design matters, right? It depends on how you design the participation. So if you just, if you think, oh, let's just lower the barriers and so we'll open access to everyone, ironically, what it does is that, if it's a kind of first come, first serve kind of a process, people who have privilege, who are paying attention to the issues will get that significant head start, and will kind of clog up the comment period, for example, however that's designed. But if we think, so in social science, we talk about stratification. If there are ways to do it, say you do it where it's participatory, where you pay attention to different neighborhoods, if you're talking about a large city, right? Or in a county, you subdivide it by geography and leverage the fact that you have residential segregation. Therefore, you allow, different communities to have a say by using geography as the tool. Or, maybe the type of questions that you ask, but different ways of structuring it and tiering it out so that you have communities that usually are not either invited or empowered enough in these tables to have a voice.
So I just want to point out that I think Karthik's explanation says that you can do both equitable budgeting and participatory budgeting at the same time based on design. But I would say that the primary distinction would be that participatory budgeting wants to engage people actively in the act of budgeting and setting priorities for the budgeting process and determining how the monies flow. While equitable budgeting is concerned about how to plug historic gaps or geographical gaps or gaps by stigma based on who the people are, or basically these long-standing gaps that we see by race, by ethnicity, by income, perhaps by language, by all of these variables that can actually cause governments not to invest in certain people and certain places. And so what you have is just a historic underinvestment in these people and places. And in equity, the responsibility of equitable budgeting is to not just close those gaps, but also bring those population and those locations up to a standard of living that is on par with other communities that have received consistent funding over time. So that is my distinction about the two. Sarah, did I miss anything?
No, I mean, I think that's right on. I think what I was going to point out is, we've seen some analyses of ARPA investments where it's like community engagement or equity is just like a checkbox, right? So there's like this of course, community engagement among communities that have been disinvested, face structural racism, inequities, right? Like that is a critical part of having an equitable process. But you can't just think like, oh, we opened up the process to everyone. We opened it up to the public. So that means it's equitable. Like it's not just a checkbox. I think you need to have the standards that you described around equitable budgeting applied to your participatory processes to actually know, like, are they equitable? Are people who've been disconnected from these decisions and excluded from them actually able to weigh in?
So right on cue. Right on cue, Ramon Perez has a question in the chat, or not in the Q&A, that says Toledo, Ohio has about 275,000, a population of 275,000 people. Indigenous Latina families are hard hit by COVID, but cannot get Toledo, Lucas County to provide the funding that these communities need. So they haven't gotten the percentage that they need over these past 2 years or even presently. They need help, they say. And so, they want to know how to best plan to get ARP dollars. This is a question that directly ties to the question of equitable budgeting, equitable distribution. Does anybody want to take that?
I mean, I'm from Toledo, actually, so I have a connection. And I think that, I don't know, I think, the growing Latinx, Latino communities in many places are underserved and underrecognized. Like, I think that this is a really common issue. And I think one thing I would say is just, so there's these two approaches that we've been discussing here, right? This inside outside strategy, what does there exist in government? Like, is there a local progress member? Are there some aligned government officials that you can push on in terms of having equitable structures in government? And then there's the outside piece, and I don't know the structure of community organizing and advocacy in Toledo and what groups are there. But I know that there's a lot of housing and community development organizations that are working in these communities and serving these communities. Like they need to be engaged in the process, which, as somebody brought up, philanthropy. How can philanthropy help in these processes, right? You need the outside engagement and advocacy. Like those groups that are they're the ones getting vaccines to the communities. Like they're the ones that have the connections, the cultural competencies, the language, right? So those groups need to be funded to work on advocacy, to work on equitable budgeting and budget advocacy. And so I think that foundations are getting less shy around the need for advocacy, but like we need to really ramp that up.
I just want to cut in here, and I'm going to let you, Diallo, go, but Glennie Poo actually says, you know, there needs to be outside help to help make this happen. Some of these local governmental officials are clueless and are only interested in putting a new metal roof on the city hall or obtaining new equipment with the money, or sprucing up their decor and raising the pay of a few city employees. For every one bright example, there's probably 25 dark ones. And so, I think that this is the point here. Diallo, were you going to cut in?
Yeah, I'm just going to cut in and say that part of getting at equity in budgeting and also getting at participation in budgeting is also demystifying the budgeting process. I think it's the most, like, people lean in on the policy, but then when the policy has to lead to a budget that actually is there to implement the policy, I think that there's a lot of drop off in engagement and participation. And I think a lot of it is certain communities are locked out of that process, locked out of even understanding how the budget works. I even work with elected officials that are locked out of the process, even in their own legislative bodies. And so it's making sure our elected officials are educated on the budgeting process and the importance of engaging there, but also that our communities have the tools necessary to understand the process. And I think a lot of what our partners are doing around creating dashboards that create some transparency of where these dollars are going helps folks to be able to lean in on budgeting, because if they don't know that this amount of dollars is going to transportation, no dollars are going to housing and healthcare, this is what's going to education, it's hard for folks to kind of lean in and say, hey, this is where we need to shift. And so we need to create, like you said, like folks said before, some advocacy around really helping folks to demystify the budgeting process.
When we say advocacy, are we talking about in the streets advocacy? Are we talking about, what are we talking about here?
I mean, it's both and. It's the advocacy to make sure that our elected officials are sharing the right types of information with communities. It's the advocacy to make sure that not only communities are there at the table, but they have the education that they need in order to make the types of decisions that are in their best interest around budgets. Because there's a lot of fool's gold out there around budgets, and folks will, other organizations will put out bad information that will lead folks to the wrong place. And so we want to demystify that, give folks accurate information and tools to be able to engage.
Sarah Beth?
Yeah, I think just like we want to hold up bright spots of local governments, equity and engagement, we want to hold up bright spots of advocacy. And there's some really great things happening. In North Carolina, there's a large coalition that's come together with state organizations, kind of leading the way and organizing it, but really being there as a resource for community-based organizations, holding action hours where they all come together and write letters together, where they share resources and go after funding together. So there's really exciting stuff happening there. We did an activist guide, and I'll put it in the chat. Pittsburgh is in there, New Orleans, Detroit, a couple other places. And all of these leaders, or a lot of them, are doing this for the first time. And they're very willing to talk about it. So if anybody wants connections, I'm happy to make connections, because there's some really exciting stuff happening in the advocacy space here.
Very good. Now, I did put all the contact information for all of our presenters in the chat early on. So if you didn't see it, scroll up to the very top. I want to actually probably wind us up at this point with this last question, which is important. And actually, Ann Pratt actually asked a version of it in the chat. And that is based on, how do we institutionalize some of these best practices so that they stand the test of time? We know that ARP, actually, the American Rescue Plan, will sunset. And so Ann Pratt asks, how do we make sure that holding public officials accountable is an on-ramp to making sure that infrastructure dollars that are being distributed now are actually also done in an equitable fashion? And then how we might use Justice 40's initiatives over the next 10 years to continue this work. So who would like to start? Sarah Beth, it's on you right now. If you'd like to start, go ahead.
Karthik's unmuted, so I feel like
I'll go next, Sarah.
Okay. So one of the things that we're working on right now that we'll hopefully publish in the fall is really a lessons learned of federal funds implementation challenges and kind of being the librarians of COVID. So I feel like we've all been, creating the plane as we've been flying it. All these organizations have been doing good work, and governments have as well. But we really need to capture the learnings at this point so that they're not lost, and capture the innovations that were made. So we're going to be doing a research project, interviewing anybody that will talk to us, to really talk about what were the barriers to making an impact in community and to implementing federal funds at the local level, but then also what were the best practices and solutions.
Karthik?
I'll answer this question with a call to action for philanthropy, because all that we're talking about here, like, oh, there are all these resources that people can use. Well, guess what? For those resources to actually be used, you need to have technical assistance. If you're talking about budget analysis and advocacy, and this is something that I've talked at least to a couple of funders in California, we have this mismatch, right, in terms of, say, public safety unions who are always at the table and know exactly how the budget game is being played. And you have a coalition of equity partners that don't have any kind of shared resources where someone is paying attention to the budget, knowing when to go to those county supervisor meetings and knowing how to advocate, knowing when to do that street advocacy, if you will, and bring that show of force to show that voters are paying attention. This does not happen for free. So absolutely, philanthropy has to make sure that whatever resources and toolkits that are being developed, for it to actually be implemented, you need to invest in that technical assistance and that translation from more general resources to where it lands in particular communities.
Yeah, I would double down. I want to double down on what Karthik just said. And one of the things that we're doing at SHOT is this crew table is a part of our Loving Cities initiative that we've been working on. And one of the things we're working hard on is trying to incubate civic tables in cities around the country. And so having a national table that's providing some technical assistance and having that supported, but also having local philanthropy help to hold up these civic infrastructures that are on an ongoing basis, looking at the budget, have dashboards that are created to really show where those dollars are going and making sure that those dollars are going to equity. And then you're creating structures that are over a longer term able to really support this kind of work moving forward. So whatever federal funds flow into cities and states, there's a structure in place to say, okay, these dollars have just come in. How are they flowing to equity? How does the community know about how these dollars are moving to equity? And where's that national table that we're able to liaison with that has some expertise about what's happening around the country and some best practices?
No, Diallo, but historically, foundations, philanthropy, they'll invest in an initiative for 10 years. They'll invest in, a collaboration for 3 years. And then, and then they go away. So are you saying that a different model of philanthropy is needed for this era?
Definitely longer term investment is needed for a longer term strategy of really creating real change. The beauty of this is that we're intersecting with so many different issue areas. So even as philanthropy may change their issue priorities are still a part of this larger package because the budget touches on every issue priority. So this is the intersectional place in which philanthropy can really deep dive invest for a longer term to really support the type of change that they say their dollars are meant for. I think there's a tremendous opportunity here to create the types of structures we need in order to really move us toward equity.
So you're saying at the local level, we need collective impact tables across the country that really double down on authentic grassroots participation, that brings people from the margins to the mainstream, and that centers equity over the long term, that this is an investment in long-term infrastructure building.
Correct.
Okay, Sylvia.
I want to build on that. I think Diallo's right in terms of thinking about how we do a paradigm shift about how we think our funding. And so one of the things that we were thinking about at Local Progress is what is the role of local elected leaders to think, to change, to shift the way that we think about funding our institutions and systems, and how do we preemptively fight back against the attacks and the pushes for austerity measures. And so we've been already doing some creative thinking about municipal finance and revenue, and thinking about different types of sources, getting ahead of the austerity pushes. And so one of the things that we've been thinking about is how we organize folks to think differently about municipal finance in terms of where that money comes from, and not just taxation and not just bonds, but how are we organizing ourselves to really push the Federal Reserve to play a different role in municipal finance. And yeah, so that's sort of one trajectory for us. So I love that line of thinking, Diallo.
And then Sarah, I'd like you to wind us down with your response, but also link it to, I know that Policy Link is recently launching an initiative around infrastructure. You know, what's the bridge here?
Yeah, so I think like the infrastructure that's needed for community on the community side, because we have, so Local Progress is a wonderful network of these progressive local electeds, and the Government Alliance on Racial Equity is a great network for those working inside city government, right? What is the network for community? There is not one, there's not a network for folks that are working on equity in budgeting, you know, which is the ARPA conversation, right? We need those sorts of structures. And for infrastructure, it's the same. And that's what we're trying to build is, you know, what is the network for sharing best practices around advocating for infrastructure to go toward equitable uses. And that is a whole different conversation, because the decision-making around the infrastructure dollars, that's going to happen at metropolitan planning organizations and at states. These are not city budgeting decisions. So it's a completely different type of process that communities will need to engage in. So that's what we're trying to build with you all.
So I'd like to thank our audience for staying with us. I'd like to thank Karthik. I'd like to thank Sarah Beth Gale. I'd like to thank Sarah and Sylvia and Diallo for a fantastic panel discussion, I think, today. But I want to take moderator's privilege to end with what I think is at stake. We will have had, between the CARES Act, between ARP, the American Rescue Plan, and now the flowing of infrastructure dollars, we will have had a historic amount of funding coming down from the federal government to states, counties, and localities. Trillions of dollars. I mean, this is not just a generational, something that happens once in a generation. It doesn't happen, even sometimes in a century. And if we're not careful, we will have let these historic investments bypass the very communities that need it the most, meaning that we will have blinked our eyes at an incredibly important time when the decisions were being made, meaning that this is how inequity is perpetuated over time and across generations. The communities that have been hardest hit, that suffer the greatest health disparities, educational disparities, the income and wealth disparities, will still be in the same situation after all these dollars are spent. And I'm just going to end by saying we're better than that. But in order to be better than that, we must do better. Thank you for joining us.